Okay, as promised, the much awaited, much researched, much nerdified guide to houseplant pests. Take two. I know a lot of people will do videos about houseplant pests, and they'll kind of do one per pest, one video per pest, and I thought that's not really helpful for people who don't know what they're dealing with and don't know what to look for. So I thought I would just cover the majority of houseplant pests that you can get. So we'll talk about signs that can help you figure out which pest you've got, type of plants those pests like, the way they'll kill your plant, and most importantly, how to get rid of them. First though, let's talk about the signs that you actually have pests, because these bugs and critters are so tiny. They're usually really hard to see with the naked eye. Now, the problem with this, of course, is that it mimics a lot of other problems houseplants can have. So this isn't exclusive to critters, but it's still a good list to triage against. So speckled leaves, like if they start to have a paint splatter look to them and they're not normally that way, your leaves begin to develop a yellow or reddish tint to them. You start to see holes. You start to see very fine webs. Your plants are developing deformed buds. Your plants develop a sticky residue to the leaves or the stems or the flowers. White fuzz on the leaves, the stems, or sometimes even the soil. And finally, wrinkled or curled leaves. Now again, all of these problems can mean a myriad of reasons, not just pests, but knowing those signs can kind of help you go along the right path. So now let's cover the most common houseplant pests you're gonna find. Spider mites is number one. They look like teeny tiny little red spiders that live in colonies. Typically you can't see them by the naked eye because they're so small, so what you're gonna wanna look for are very fine cobwebs. If you find a web, but it goes a longer distance, like between a stem and a leaf, and there's sort of a canyon, that's not the right word, but you know what I mean, between them, that's probably not a spider mite, that's probably just a regular house spider. Instead, the webbing of a spider mite is going to be like a dense cluster. Plants that they love, whatever you got, they'll be happy to live on, especially if they have ornamental leaves like orchids, because they can build their webs off of them very easily. Spider mites will destroy the plant by feeding off plant tissue and sucking out the sap, basically siphoning off all the nutrients that your plants need to survive. How you can kill them: up the humidity around the plant by either spraying the leaves, adding a gravel tray with water, and use either neem oil or diluted dish soap and wipe the leaves down. Next is mealybugs. Mealybugs typically clump together and they'll look like little pieces of white fuzz. You'll typically find them on plants that have high nitrogen levels, as well as plants that have soft stems, so like succulents, rosemary, citrus, stuff like that. Like spider mites, honestly, the majority of pests, the way that they destroy the plant is by siphoning off nutrients, sort of like become little vampires. To kill mealybugs, your best bet is to chop. You're gonna want to cut out any leaves or stems that have heavy infestations. If there's leaves that you want to save, your best bet is to dab them with rubbing alcohol so that you're killing off the eggs, because they are incredibly hard to find. Once you've done that, rub neem oil on the plant to help disrupt the growth cycle to ensure that mealybugs do not reproduce or hatch. Next is gnats. And I sigh because gnats are just, they are so frustrating. Gnats and fruit flies will typically get mixed up as one and the same. Gnats are little brown or black oblong looking specks in the dirt, and they have a body shape that's kind of like a mosquito. Gnats are really bad flyers. You'll typically find them in any plant that loves moist soil, so especially tropical plants that live under the canopy in a rainforest, orchids, things like that. Now, the adult gnat isn't actually a destructive pest, it's just more of a nuisance. However, the problem is the larvae. Gnat larvae live in the soils and will feast on nutrients that your plants need to take from the soil to thrive. So they're like other bugs being parasites, except instead of being parasites directly on the plant, they're in the soil. How to kill them? It's not easy, and I'm sure if you've ever had a gnat infestation, you know that too. Your best bet is to do what you can to disrupt the life cycle. Use those yellow sticky traps. Change your watering routine by watering from the bottom. Use like a watering tray or something like that. By watering from the bottom, you keep the top soil dry, which is a great way to prevent the larvae from growing. Some people also really swear by adding cinnamon to the soil as a fungus killer, which is gnats' main food supply. I've never tried that, so I can't vouch for it, but just letting you know what I saw on the internet and who lies on the internet. Next is fruit flies. Fruit flies are those annoying little bugs that fly right into your face, like little spiteful kamikaze bugs. And the best way to differentiate between gnats and fruit flies look like tiny little flies, whereas gnats look more like mosquitoes. Plants that gnats love, actually, they don't live in houseplants. The reason that you'll typically find them around your houseplant is because they love what's around it. They love the humidity. They're also big fans of decaying fruit and will typically be around plants that have a sweet smell to them. So jasmine, gardenias, things like that. Also, you'll probably find them around trash cans, again, because of the decay. And while they are very much a nuisance and jerks for flying in your face, they're actually not destructive to houseplants. But if you want to get rid of them, your best bet is to reduce the things that they love. So reduce moisture around the top layer of soil by watering from the bottom and keeping your trash can clean, removing any kind of decaying fruit or organic matter around your house, just basically keeping it clean. You can also run a UV light as it attracts the fruit flies. I have a video where I test the Pest UV light for I think a couple of days, and you can see the results. It's pretty effective, but is not a one-stop shop, is the best way I can put it. It requires constant usage if you have a fruit fly problem. If you have a fruit fly problem, wow, that is hard to say. Next, aphids. Aphids look like groups of tiny gray, black, or even translucent yellow or green bugs. And they're also squishy to the touch, and I'll get into why I'm mentioning that in a minute. They're born wingless, so if you actually see an aphid flying around, that means that the colony has gotten pretty big and they've sent out scouts to look for new locations. So you've got to act immediately. Aphids are typically found in most outdoor crops, but they can occasionally find their way inside. And the way that they will destroy your plants is by sucking out nutrients from leaves and stems, and then, as like an extra middle finger, will secrete a honeydew-like residue that attracts ants and encourages mold, which just brings a whole bunch of new problems for you. So if you see aphids, act quickly because they're gonna bring friends. Your best bet for getting rid of them is to soak a Q-tip in rubbing alcohol and wipe off the leaves that you see aphids on, and honestly, wipe down all the leaves just to be safe. And then spray with a hose. A lot of people get satisfaction from putting like the high pressure on the hose and spraying the aphids off. I'm sure it's a very satisfying feeling. Next is scale. Scale is a pest, and the reason most people refer to it as scale is because they have a very hard-like armor on them as opposed to the squishy little aphids. Scale looks like brownish oval bugs. They typically live in groups on the underside of leaves. Scale can be found on most houseplants, but they especially love ivy, figs, and citrus trees. Like other houseplant pests, the way they destroy a houseplant is through parasitic means. Vampires, basically, they suck out the sap and all the nutrients that plants need to grow. And they can also secrete residue that encourages mold growth. So thanks so much for that. The way to get rid of them is to dab Q-tips with rubbing alcohol directly on them to break down that hard armor, and then spray them with either neem oil or water. Same thing as with aphids, it's a very satisfying feeling to like hit them with the hose and watch them go flying, just like out. Next is springtails. I'm only including springtails on this list because they are commonly treated as pests, but they're actually pretty good dudes. Springtails look like wingless brown or black bugs that live in soil. You'll typically notice them because their movement is crawling or jumping. Springtails love moist soil, so you'll find them in tropical houseplants, and they also thrive really well in moist terrariums. Now, again, they do not typically become pests because they're like a cleanup crew. They will eat mold, they will eat fungi, or dead leaves that fall into the soil because they really love decaying matter. However, if the population gets too big, some people have reported that they found springtails will go after live tissue too. But that's only really if you have them in houseplants that are grouped. If you have them in a closed terrarium, it's typically a self-regulating population, so you shouldn't have that sort of issue. But if you want to get rid of them, if they're just like jumping at you and being crazy, then what you would want to do is make sure the top level of soil is as dry as possible and keep a good routine of removing any decaying matter or fallen leaves from the soil so that you disrupt their food source. Next is thrips. Thrips look like little bugs that grow in a colony. Thrips typically love any houseplant you've got, but in particular, they're really prone to hanging out on plants that have long, thinner leaves, so like alocasias, things like that. They also really love flowers that are blue, yellow, or white. Thrips destroy the plants by eating the sap, and the problem with a thrip infestation is that they work extremely fast to suck out as many nutrients as possible in as quickly time as possible to grow the colony. Your best method for defeating thrips is to spray with water and pay attention to the undersides of the leaves and places where leaves meet the stems, as these can be really hard to treat areas and are places that thrips love to live. After the water spray, you're going to want to spray the plant very well with insecticide or neem oil and keep up the treatment for a few weeks. If nothing's working, you can actually buy thrip predator packs, which are packets of bugs that feed on thrips, but they can get pretty spendy. So if you can treat it with neem oil or insecticide and water first and really stick to a schedule, you'll probably be able to defeat the colony. But if you want a shortcut or have ADHD, like some people, then you might just want to bite the bullet and buy the predator packets. Next is whiteflies. Whiteflies look like teeny little white moths, and they love tropical houseplants and also warm weather crops like tomato, peppers, potatoes, basically things that like a lot of humidity. Whiteflies will destroy your plants by parasitic means, so they suck out the sap and then they exude a honeydew kind of residue that can attract ants, create mold growth, and that whole fun cycle of annoying things to deal with. How to kill them? Interestingly, researchers have found that whiteflies are attracted to the color yellow, so yellow sticky traps are incredibly successful. In addition to that, you'll also want to spray down the plant, the leaves and the stems with a hose to remove any eggs that are hanging out in the nooks and crannies of the houseplant. So those are the majority of the plant pests you're going to find, including the ways to kill them. But let me talk more about how you can fix any kind of infestation you're coming across. First is to isolate the plant as quickly as possible once you notice pest growth, because colonies can grow very quickly, very fast, and the more plants they spread to, the harder it's going to be to defeat them. Next, check both sides of the leaves, particularly the undersides, especially if you have leaves that sort of have like a concave to them, sort of like fiddle-leaf figs. Shine a light through the leaf if you can and try and look for any sort of movement, because smaller pests are typically really hard to see with the naked eye. Once you've done that and located the pests, you're going to want to blast with a strong stream of water from a hose or a faucet, but not a pressure washer. Don't go that crazy. Your plants can't handle that kind of pressure. We can't handle that kind of pressure either in today's society. What the hell am I talking about? Next, keep any sort of decaying matter off of the top layer of soil. So dead leaves, whatever else could be decaying on the soil, and remove any fungus you find, because fungus can be very yummy treats for these pests. Next, try adding mosquito bits. These are little white, I have some. Where is, oh, they're there. So here's what mosquito bits look like. They kind of look like granola. And what you do is add them to the soil. They are a natural insecticide that will eat larvae and mosquitoes, but they're also really good for houseplant pests too. After that, you're gonna wanna spray down the plant with neem oil or diluted dish soap. A lot of people like Dawn, but your store brand's fine too. Just make sure it's diluted. You're also going to want to keep continuous surveillance on the plants. Don't assume that just because you did all of these steps that the problem is solved. The more attention you give it, the easier the problem's going to be to solve. So give it at least 1 week of constant treatment and monitoring before you decide whether or not you've solved the problem. Finally, if you want to hit like the red emergency button, consider getting some predatory bugs. These are bugs that love to munch on the larvae of these pests and will disrupt their growth cycle and kill off the colony. I will not embarrass myself by trying to say any of these names. I will put them here. There you go. That is my hopefully semi-comprehensive guide to helping you get rid of pests on your houseplants. But the best treatment method is prevention. So watch this video where I go into how to acclimate any plant that you get, whether it's online, big box store, clipping, whatever, to ensure that whatever friends they brought along with them do not end up infesting the rest of your houseplants. I'll see you over there.